Chapter 1. Born on the Edge of a New Nation. Andrew Jackson entered the world on March 15, 1767, in the rugged backcountry between North and South Carolina, an area that future historians would call the Waxhaws. His birthplace was not a grand home or a well-established town, but a frontier settlement of scattered farms, pine forests, and red clay roads. The land was hard, the winters biting, and life was a matter of labor, resilience, and will. His parents, Andrew and Elizabeth Jackson, were immigrants from what was then known as Ulster, Northern Ireland, part of a wave of Scotch-Irish settlers fleeing poverty, political tensions, and religious restrictions in Europe. They sought a place of possibility, where one might rise not because of heritage, but through efforts and perseverance. The colonies offered such a chance, though it was a promise wrapped in hardship. Andrew Jackson never knew his father. Only weeks before his birth, the elder Andrew Jackson died from an accident while helping clear land. Elizabeth was left a widow with 2 sons already, Hugh and Robert, and a third arriving into a world defined by uncertainty. She did not have wealth, but she possessed extraordinary strength of spirit. Those who later remembered her described a woman of deep faith, sharp intelligence, and relentless determination to raise her sons into men of character. The household that raised Andrew was one of necessity, not comfort. Work was constant, food could be scarce. The frontier offered freedom, yet danger was equally present. Wild animals roamed nearby woods, storms could strip crops overnight, and illness was a constant threat. Communities depended on cooperation. Neighbors were not simply acquaintances. They were the difference between survival and loss. From an early age, Andrew displayed a fiery temperament. He was quick to speak, quick to defend himself, and unwilling to yield, even when yielding might have been the wiser path. The adults around him saw 2 futures. Either the boy would become a leader, or his boldness would destroy him. This intensity did not come from arrogance, but from the fierce independence of someone who learned early that the world would not offer him protection or guarantees. The American colonies during Andrew's childhood were changing rapidly. Whispers of resistance against British rule grew louder each season. Taxes imposed from across the ocean, military presence in colonial towns, and laws that felt distant and unjust stirred anger in many settlers, especially in the backcountry where life already felt like a constant struggle. Talk of liberty was not a philosophical matter, it was personal. By the time Andrew turned 10, the conflict that would become the American Revolutionary War was underway. Local militias formed. Farmers picked up rifles that had once been tools of hunting and began drilling in open fields. The smell of gunpowder, the urgency of shouted orders, the tension in the air, these became part of Andrew's world. War was not distant. It was on the doorstep. At 13, Andrew joined as a courier for local militia forces. He was too young to fight in battle, but old enough to carry messages through forests and over dangerous terrain. Riding fast, keeping secrets, evading capture, this was the duty of boys who grew up faster than their years. It was a childhood shaped not by school books or games, but by the demands of a nation struggling to define itself. In 1781, Andrew and his older brother Robert were captured by British soldiers. The 2 boys, exhausted and hungry, were brought before a British officer who ordered them to clean his boots. Robert refused. Andrew followed, declaring that he was a prisoner of war, not a servant. The officer's response was swift. He struck Andrew with his sword. The blade slashed across Jackson's head and hand, drawing blood and leaving a scar that would remain visible throughout his life. But the deeper mark was an internal one: anger, humiliation, and a memory that would shape his view of authority forever. The conditions in the prison camp were brutal. Disease spread quickly, food was barely enough to sustain life. Robert grew ill with smallpox and died soon after their release. Andrew himself only survived because of his mother, Elizabeth, who traveled miles to negotiate her son's freedom and then nursed Andrew back from the brink of death. Her compassion saved him, but her strength could not protect her from the hardships of the time. While aiding Continental prisoners later that year, she contracted fever and passed away. Andrew was 14. He was now alone. The war had taken his family, it had scarred his body, it had hardened his spirit. The boy who emerged from these losses was no longer a child formed by the security of a home. He was shaped instead by grief, rebellion, and a sense that survival depended on his own resolve. The frontier had taught him that perseverance was not a virtue, it was a necessity. And the war had taught him that power respected only those who refused to bend. In the years that followed, Andrew wandered through work, apprenticeships, and studies. He attempted school, but formal education held less appeal than the practical knowledge of survival and ambition. Eventually, he found direction in the study of law. He was not a scholar in the classical sense. His learning was driven by practical purpose. The law, he believed, could be a weapon, a means to assert oneself in a world where status was often inherited rather than earned. His early background, full of hardship and struggle, forged a trait that would define him for the rest of his life. The sense that he represented not elites nor institutions, but the ordinary citizen who had to fight for every inch of ground gained. He was not yet the general, the political figure, or the president, but the foundation of that future had been laid. Andrew Jackson had been born in poverty, loss, and conflict, but he had also been born into a new world. A nation was forming around him, filled with possibility and contradiction. And in that nation, he began to find his place. Chapter 2: Law, Ambition, and the Call of the Frontier. In the years after the war, Andrew Jackson's life unfolded without the steady guidance of family. He lived with relatives at times, worked small jobs, and at one point taught school, though it was clear that he was not built for the quiet discipline of classroom life. Restless energy drove him towards something larger, though he could not yet define what that would be. The war had left him with a profound belief that the world rewarded strength, will, and independence. He needed a path that allowed him to assert those qualities. Law presented itself as that path. In 1784, Jackson began studying under established lawyers in Salisbury, North Carolina. The legal apprenticeship system was demanding in its own way. Long hours reading legal texts, copying documents, learning court procedures, and studying the principles of property, contract, and criminal justice. Jackson was not a scholar of refinement, but he possessed a sharp memory and an ability to argue with clarity and force. More importantly, he understood people, what motivated them, what frightened them, and what stirred their loyalties. Jackson earned his license to practice law in 1787, but the settled towns of North Carolina offered limited prospects for someone of his background and temperament. Opportunity, he believed, lay further west, in territories where social hierarchies were less entrenched. The frontier was a place where men could reinvent themselves, where reputation could be built on action rather than ancestry. So he traveled to the Southwest Territory, what would later become Tennessee. It was a land of promise and uncertainty. Thick forests, winding rivers, and fertile soil awaited those willing to work and to fight for it. Settlers arrived by the thousands, clearing land, building towns, and negotiating treaties, sometimes peacefully, often through conflict, with Native American nations who had lived there for centuries. There was little order and even less predictability. Violence, disputes, and survival challenges were part of everyday life. In this world, lawyers were not ivory tower professionals. They were negotiators, mediators, advocates, and at times, peacekeepers. Jackson's sharp tongue, boldness, and willingness to confront opponents directly made him not only noticeable, but respected. He could be harsh, sometimes impulsive, yet he earned a reputation as someone who did not back down. Jackson soon became a public prosecutor in Davidson County, headquartered in the young settlement of Nashville. He pursued criminals, settled disputes, and established a presence in the region's developing legal system. Court sessions were held in log buildings. Judges sometimes rode on horseback from county to county. The law was not written in tidy volumes. It was shaped case by case, argument by argument, personality by personality. In Nashville, Jackson was introduced to the powerful Donaldson family. It was here he met Rachel Donaldson Robards, a woman of strong spirit, warm character, and deep emotional sensitivity. Rachel had married young, but her marriage had become strained and unhappy. Jackson and Rachel formed a close friendship, one that soon turned into love. Their relationship became a matter of local discussion, sometimes supportive, often judgmental. Divorce in that era was complicated and slow, and misunderstandings over Rachel's legal marital status later created controversy that would follow Jackson throughout his life. But for Jackson, Rachel became his emotional anchor. Where his early life had been defined by loss, with Rachel he found stability, affection, and a sense of belonging he had never truly known. Their home at the Donaldson settlement, later the Hermitage, began modestly, but it represented something precious to Jackson, a place of his own, a sanctuary earned through perseverance. As Jackson's personal life took root, his public influence expanded. He purchased land and entered into business ventures. He became acquainted with leaders of local militias. His confidence and assertiveness positioned him naturally among the rising voices of Tennessee's society. The frontier did not reward caution. It rewarded action, decisiveness, and the willingness to take risks, traits Jackson possessed in abundance. By the mid-19th century, Tennessee was ready to transition from territory to statehood. Delegates gathered to draft a state constitution, propose boundaries, and organize governmental structures. Jackson, respected and well-known, became part of this historic moment. He was elected as Tennessee's first U.S. representative in 1796, and shortly after became a U.S. senator. His time in Congress was brief, however. Jackson did not enjoy the slow, procedural nature of legislative politics. He returned home and accepted a position as a judge on the Tennessee Superior Court. As a judge, Jackson displayed the same qualities he had shown as a lawyer: firmness, clarity, and directness. He was not a legal theorist. He believed justice should be practical, swift, and fair to the common man. His rulings were respected more for their strength of reasoning than for elegant expression. Yet beneath all of this, law, politics, properties, social standing, another identity was forming, one that would define Jackson more than any other: the military leader. The frontier was never far from conflict. Settlers clashed with neighboring Native American nations. European powers, Spain and Britain, still influenced the region, hoping to weaken American control. Local militias were essential for defense. Jackson, with his commanding presence and unwavering confidence, rose quickly within militia ranks. He was a leader who inspired fierce loyalty. His men believed he would fight with them, suffer with them, and never order them to endure what he would not endure himself. It was not charisma in the usual sense. It was conviction, the sense that Jackson believed every word he spoke. By the end of the 1790s, Andrew Jackson was no longer the boy forced to survive through loss and conflict. He was a landowner, a public official, a husband, a lawyer, and a militia officer. Yet the world around him was changing. The young nation continued to expand, negotiate, and struggle with identity and direction. Chapter 3: The Making of a Warrior. By the dawn of the 19th century, Andrew Jackson had secured a place of prominence in Tennessee. He owned land, served as a judge, and held rank in the state militia. Yet his story was only beginning. The frontier was a land of shifting alliances, contested territories, and political intrigue, and Jackson was drawn toward the arena that would define his identity for generations: war. The frontier was never still. Settlers and Native American nations lived in parallel worlds, each struggling to maintain land, identity, and survival. The United States was expanding westward, driven by belief in settlement as a symbol of national destiny. Native nations defended ancestral territory. The British and the Spanish remained active in influencing tribal alliances, hoping to weaken the young American Republic. Tensions simmered constantly, sometimes erupting into violence with startling intensity. Jackson was not merely a bystander to these tensions. He believed deeply that America's expansion was inevitable and justified, a view shared by many of his contemporaries. He also believed that loyalty, whether to neighbor, community, or nation, was sacred. When conflict threatened those he considered his people, he felt compelled to act. In 1801, Jackson was appointed Major General of the state militia. The position suited him perfectly. Command did not just grant authority, it required presence. Jackson thrived in environments where decisive leadership mattered. He dressed plainly, spoke directly, and demanded from his men exactly what he demanded of himself: endurance, courage, and unwavering resolve. Life in the militia was harsh. Supplies were unreliable. Communication across the frontier was slow. Soldiers often came from farms, leaving crops and families behind. Jackson understood their sacrifices and believed a commander must share the suffering of his men. They followed him not because he was polished or aristocratic, but because he was one of them, simply elevated by force of will. The defining moment of Jackson's rise came during the War of 1812, a conflict between the United States and the British Empire that rippled across the continent. The war did not remain confined to distant battlefields. British influence fueled Native American alliances in the South, where leaders sought to resist American expansion. One of the most significant conflicts to arise from this was the Creek War, 1813 to 1814. At the heart of the Creek War was a division within the Creek Nation itself. A faction known as the Red Sticks sought to expel American settlers and resist U.S. influence, aligning with broader Native resistance movements. Violent clashes erupted across the region, culminating in the attack on Fort Mims, where hundreds were killed. The United States saw it as a call to respond with overwhelming force. Jackson marched, but he marched under conditions that would have broken a lesser commander. Supplies were scarce. Roads were nearly impassable. His men were cold, hungry, and exhausted. They threatened mutiny on more than one occasion. Jackson refused to retreat, not out of stubbornness alone, but because he believed retreat meant surrendering the frontier and perhaps the nation's future to chaos. When soldiers lacked food, Jackson gave him his own horse to carry supplies. When their feet bled from lack of boots, he walked beside them. He had known hunger and cold as a boy. They did not intimidate him now. His men saw this, and they followed. The campaign reached its climax at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where Jackson led American soldiers, Tennessee militia, and allied Cherokee warriors against the fortified Red Stick stronghold. The fighting was fierce and desperate. Jackson directed assaults with relentless determination. When the battle ended, the Red Stick resistance was effectively broken. The Treaty of Fort Jackson that followed forced massive land cessions from the Creek people, many of whom had not supported the Red Stick Rebellion. The consequences would echo through generations. To Jackson, the treaty was necessary to secure the frontier. To others, especially those whose land was taken, it was a profound and bitter loss. History would remember both truths. Jackson's reputation soared. Newspapers called him the defender of the frontier. Settlers saw him as a hero who protected their homes and futures. His name carried weight far beyond Tennessee. Yet even as Jackson gained national prominence, the war expanded. British forces were preparing an assault on New Orleans, the gateway to the Mississippi River and the entire American West. If the British captured it, the consequences would be catastrophic. America could lose control over its trade, territory, and western expansion. In December 1814, Jackson arrived in New Orleans to organize defenses. The city was a mix of cultures: French, Spanish, African, Creole, American, chaotic and vibrant. The population doubted that the United States could stand against the world's most powerful military. Local leaders worried. Jackson did not. He gathered whoever he could: militia, frontiersmen, free black soldiers, Choctaw warriors, pirates loyal to Jean Lafayette, even men who had never seen formal battle. Jackson believed that courage, not pedigree, determined a soldier's worth. As the British advanced, Jackson built earthworks, strengthened artillery positions, and coordinated supply lines. He knew the terrain. He knew the stakes. He knew that fear could only be defeated by resolve. On January 8, 1815, the British launched a massive frontal assault. Cannons thundered, smoke thickened the air. Rows of red-coated soldiers marched toward entrenched American positions. Jackson moved among his men, calm, watchful, commanding. The British attack collapsed. In less than an hour, the British suffered devastating casualties. American losses were minimal. Against all expectations, Jackson had achieved one of the most decisive victories in American military history. Even though the war had technically ended weeks earlier with the Treaty of Ghent, news had not yet reached the battlefield. To the public, the Battle of New Orleans became proof that America could stand against the greatest empire of the age. Jackson became a national hero. He was celebrated in newspapers, praised in songs, and welcomed with parades. For many Americans, especially those outside the old elite, Jackson became the embodiment of American strength, self-made success, and frontier courage. But greatness always comes with shadow. The victories that defined his reputation also deepened his belief in force as justification for policy. The war had taught him that struggle was necessary to secure the nation's future. The frontier had taught him that survival sometimes demanded harsh decisions. These convictions, powerful and unyielding, would shape his presidency and scar many who stood in his path. For now, however, Jackson stood as a hero of the Republic, a man who rose from poverty, loss, and hardship to shape the destiny of a nation. Chapter 4. The Hero Returns. Politics Awaken. The victory at New Orleans transformed Andrew Jackson from a frontier general into a national symbol. His name traveled across taverns and newspapers from Boston to New Orleans. Farmers spoke of him as a champion of the common man. Veterans recalled how he shared hardship with his troops. Even in cities far from the frontier, Jackson became a figure of fascination, a man who rose from orphaned poverty to defeat the greatest military force in the world. But America was a young nation, still shaping its identity. The founding fathers had passed leadership to a new generation, one less refined by philosophical debate and more defined by expansion, ambition, and conflict. Jackson was returning to a country entering a new political era. When Jackson returned to Tennessee, celebrations greeted him at every stop. People crowded dusty roads just to see him ride past. They cheered not only for the general, but for what he represented. A break from the old aristocratic leadership rooted in Virginia and New England. Jackson was not a polished statesman. He was raw, direct, and emotional. He spoke plainly, and people listened. Yet, beneath the cheers, a different conversation had begun. Some political elites feared Jackson. They saw him as unpredictable, too quick to anger, too willing to rely on personal judgment instead of cautious diplomacy. His popularity threatened the established order. They wondered whether a man of his temperament could lead a nation rather than command an army. Jackson himself did not immediately seek political power. He returned to the Hermitage, his plantation outside Nashville, where he and Rachel built a life filled with quiet routines and warm gatherings. Jackson tended to business, expanded his land, and hosted guests who wanted to see the hero in person. He cherished Rachel's presence. She softened him, balanced him, reminded him of the peace he had never known as a child. But the world would not allow him to remain still. The Seminole Conflict. In 1817, tension flared along the border of Spanish Florida. Seminole groups, runaway slaves seeking refuge, and various native communities challenged U.S. claims and settlements along the frontier. American settlers demanded protection. Politicians debated strategy. The military sought decisive action. President Monroe authorized Jackson to secure the region, though his orders were ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation. Jackson did not hesitate. He marched into Florida with the same determination he had shown before. He captured key forts, executed 2 British citizens accused of inciting resistance, and effectively seized control of the region, despite Spain still holding sovereignty over it. Diplomats in Washington were stunned. To his supporters, Jackson had once again defended American lives and territory with courage and decisiveness. To critics, he had violated international law, risked war, and acted beyond his authority. But the political winds favored Jackson. The Adams-Onis Treaty soon followed, in which Spain ceded Florida to the United States. What some called reckless, others called visionary. Jackson left the conflict with greater national stature than before. He had reshaped the map of the continent. The election of 1824. By the early 1820s, the question had become unavoidable. Should Andrew Jackson run for president? Many believed the nation needed a leader who represented ordinary citizens, not wealthy political dynasties. Jackson's supporters argued that courage, conviction, and loyalty mattered more than polished education or elite pedigree. Jackson agreed. The election of 1824 featured several candidates: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Jackson. When votes were tallied, Jackson won more popular votes and more electoral votes than any other candidate, but not enough to secure victory outright. Under the Constitution, the decision moved to the House of Representatives. There, something happened that would shape Jackson's political identity forever. Speaker of the House, Henry Clay threw his support behind Adams, who then won the presidency. Shortly afterward, Adams appointed Clay Secretary of State, a position historically seen as a pathway to the presidency. To Jackson and his supporters, this was not politics. This was a corrupt bargain. Jackson felt betrayed, not just personally, but on behalf of the American people who had given him the most votes. Newspapers exploded with accusations. Citizens who felt ignored or marginalized by elites now saw Jackson as their champion against corruption. His image shifted from war hero to political crusader. Grief and fire. As Jackson's political movement gained momentum, tragedy struck. Rachel, his beloved wife, was drawn into political attacks. Opponents accused her of immorality due to confusion surrounding her earlier divorce. Newspapers mocked her character. The attacks intensified during the 1828 presidential campaign, in which Jackson again faced Adams. Rachel's health worsened. Shortly before Jackson took office, Rachel died. Her death devastated him. He believed with unwavering certainty that the cruelty of political opponents had killed her. The wound changed him. He became harder, more guarded, more willing to confront enemies directly and without hesitation. When he stood on the steps of the Capitol in March 1829 to take the oath of office as the 7th President of the United States, he did not smile. His victory was real, but it had cost him the person he loved most. The people's president. His inauguration marked a turning point in American politics. Crowds, thousands upon thousands, poured into Washington to celebrate. Many had never before felt welcome in the Capitol. To elites, the scene was chaotic. To Jackson, it was the nation finally seeing itself reflected in power. He opened the door to widows, farmers, laborers, veterans, people who had never set foot inside the halls of government. Jackson believed government belonged to them. Whether history would agree was something the future would decide. But the era of Andrew Jackson had begun. Chapter 5. The General Turns Toward Washington. The war was over. The cannons had cooled, and the young nation had begun to stretch comfortably into its victory. Yet Andrew Jackson found no rest in peace. The battlefield was only one of his stages. The political arena, loud and shifting, called to him like a horizon that could not stay still. Fame, once tasted, has a peculiar salt to it. It sharpens ambition rather than satisfying it. Newspapers across the states printed his name with an almost mythic aura. To many, he was a defender of New Orleans, the unstoppable frontier general who could bend fate with sheer will. Portraits were drawn, some flattering, some poorly, yet all shared one theme: intense eyes, jaw set like stone. A man who acted rather than merely spoke. Ordinary citizens admired him. Veterans revered him. Politicians feared him. But admiration is not a political platform. Jackson had to learn a new kind of war, one fought not with sabers and muskets, but with alliances, persuasion, and patience. Patience, unfortunately, was not a gift he possessed in abundance. He began, as many legendary American figures did, upon the frontier circuits of public speaking, town halls, taverns, dusty meeting grounds. He rode on his horse, lean as ever, his scarred face exposed to the sun and to the gaze of those who had only heard rumors. People gathered eagerly when word spread, "Jackson is in town." He spoke plainly, never indulging in the winding rhetoric of polished statesmen. His words were blunt, fiery, and honest to his core beliefs. He told them that the nation should not be an aristocrat's playground. Government should belong to the people. The farmers, the traders, the soldiers who bore the scars of the Republic's youth. The East Coast elites had controlled power too long, he insisted. America should be shaped not by inherited privilege, but by merit earned through hardship. The crowds cheered him as though he were still on a battlefield. Yet beneath these cheers, political storms gathered quietly. Washington was a place of polished boots, tailored coats, and conversations hidden behind smiles. Here, reputation could be dissected, rearranged, or tarnished with a whisper. And Jackson had enemies. Old ones who remembered duels, new ones who feared his rising popularity, and men who considered his rough frontier manner unfit for refined governance. They whispered of his temper. They spoke of the duels, the brawls, the slights that had ignited into violence. They pointed to his marriage, to the scandal that had haunted it, as evidence that he lacked the dignity required of statesmen. Every flaw was magnified. Every story was retold with embellishment. Jackson did not bend. Still, the transition was not simple. His heart, once so steady in battle, felt strain. His beloved Rachel suffered under the scrutiny and venom of politics. Washington society, with its crested invitations and judgmental gazes, treated her not as a hero's wife, but as something to be analyzed, questioned, measured. Rachel withdrew more often to their estate, seeking quiet among familiar fields and trees. Jackson rode between worlds, fighting to protect both his public ascent and the peace of the woman he loved. In this period, Jackson began forging alliances, though the word alliance for him never resembled the delicate dance that others performed. His alliances were based on respect or necessity, never flattery. He aligned with men who shared his distrust of entrenched power, who also saw the growing divide between common citizens and the political elite. Though they differed on finer points, the gravitational pull of shared belief was strong. When he finally entered the Senate again, the chamber cooled the moment he stepped inside. The polished marble and high ceilings could not soften him. He stood there like a figure carved from the very frontier itself. Some senators regarded him with a respect that bordered on awe, others with caution, a few with open disdain. Jackson noticed all of them. He remembered names. He remembered tones of voice. He proved quickly that he could speak with clarity and purpose. He was no scholar of classical philosophy, no architect of treaties weighed with subtlety. That he understood people, power, and the shape of a nation still defining itself. He argued that America must grow westward, must strengthen democracy, must resist any attempt to concentrate power in banks, aristocratic circles, or government cliques. Yet, Washington was not his home. Not yet. After a short tenure, he resigned, not in defeat, but because he knew he must gather strength somewhere more vital, among the people. To become president, one must be more than a senator. One must be a symbol. He returned to Tennessee, welcomed by crowds beneath wide skies and open roads. There, his home became a headquarters. Letters arrived daily. Visitors from distant states sought his endorsement or pledged theirs. Jackson held councils on porches, under trees, in rooms where tobacco smoke curled in the lamplight. Plans formed, not polite strategies, but movement building. He was becoming more than a man. He was becoming a force. And far away, in the capital, his opponents began to panic, not because they did not understand him, but because they did. The next chapter leads him toward a campaign that will change not only his life, but the very structure of American political identity. Chapter 6: The First Bid for the Presidency. The country was changing. New states joined the Union. Populations swelled along riverbanks and frontier clearings. Roads extended like veins, carrying news and ambition from one region to another. And through all of this, the name Andrew Jackson spread like a rumor with legs. He was no longer merely a general. He was becoming an idea, a symbol for those who believed the government had grown too distant from the people it was meant to serve. By 1824, whispers were turning into calls. Across taverns where whiskey burned warm in the throat, across farmhouses lit by oil lamps, across markets where horses stomped, people said it plainly: Jackson should be president. The idea thrilled some and terrified others. In Washington, politics was still a gentleman's game, or at least it pretended to be. Debates were laced with polite insults, alliances were sealed behind closed doors with handshakes that hid steel beneath velvet. And into this refined arena strode Andrew Jackson, the undiplomatic warrior, who preferred to say exactly what he meant. His supporters loved that about him. His opponents despised it. The election of 1824 became a peculiar crossroads. There was no single dominating party, no clear ideological divide. Instead, four major candidates emerged, each representing different regions, interests, and philosophies. John Quincy Adams, scholarly and reserved, son of a former president; Henry Clay, charismatic and strategic, master of the political compromise; William Crawford, a powerful figure with deep roots in government; and Jackson, who had something the others could not manufacture: raw public devotion. If politics were a card game, Jackson held the ace of hearts. But Washington dealt in spades. Jackson traveled, though not as widely as modern candidates might. He did not deliver choreographed speeches from stages draped in bunting. He did not print slogans. He simply appeared. Wherever he went, crowds formed as if following a migrating star. Children climbed fences for a glimpse. Old soldiers saluted. Farmers stepped away from their plows. Jackson's presence did the speaking. What he represented mattered more than what he said. He embodied the frontier spirit, the belief that courage and grit mattered more than birth or education. To many, he was proof that ordinary people could rise to greatness. But others saw something darker, a volatile man of blunt edges and deep grudges, whose temper was legendary and whose loyalties were absolute. They feared what such a man might do with power. And so the whispers began. Newspapers aligned with his rivals printed phrases sharp as bayonets. They questioned his character, his judgment, his capacity for restraint. They dissected his marriage. Rachel, kind and devout, became a target for gossip designed to wound. Jackson felt every word like a stone thrown. For all his battlefield strength, his heart was not made of iron. Rachel's dignity mattered to him more than victory itself. Seeing her suffer made his political mission feel less like ambition and more like a duty, to protect her honor by proving himself worthy of the nation's highest office. Election day came. Votes were cast. Jackson won more of the popular vote than any other candidate. He also won the most electoral votes, but not enough to claim the presidency outright. Under the Constitution, the decision moved to the House of Representatives. This was where politics stopped pretending to be polite. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House and master of influence, despised Jackson's rise. He backed John Quincy Adams, and in smoky parlors and whispered meetings, alliances formed, not by principle but by advantage. The House voted. John Quincy Adams was declared president. The newspapers called it legal. Jackson called it something else, a corrupt bargain. The phrase struck like lightning. To Jackson's supporters, it confirmed every suspicion that the elites had no intention of letting the people decide their own leader, that power was traded like a commodity among men who sat behind polished doors. Something fierce awakened in the hearts of farmers, laborers, soldiers, settlers, the very backbone of the young nation. They saw themselves in Jackson, and they saw betrayal in the Capitol dome. Jackson returned to Tennessee not in defeat, but in transformation. He was angry, fiercely, coldly angry, but unlike many men, he did not burn out. His anger sharpened into purpose. His home, the Hermitage, became the command post of a new political movement. Visitors arrived daily. Letters arrived by the stack. Jackson read each one, answering with his blunt, unmistakable script. He did not merely run again for office. He built something new, a political force made from the people themselves, a movement that would not fade with speeches, but would shape the very core of American democracy. And as winter winds passed through the bare trees of Tennessee, Andrew Jackson prepared. He had lost a vote, yes, but in losing, he had gained something far more powerful than victory. He had become the voice of a frustrated nation. The next chapter is not just about politics. It is about transformation, how a general became the center of a political storm that would reshape America's identity, its parties, and its understanding of who government was for. History had begun to bend, and Andrew Jackson, for better or worse, was the one bending it. Chapter 7: The Rising Storm. The defeat of 1824 might have ended the political hopes of most men. Many would have retired quietly, blaming circumstance or fate, and returned to private life. But Andrew Jackson was not most men. His life had taught him that setbacks were temporary and that determination, not birth or privilege, decided destiny. What had happened in the halls of Washington was, to him, not simply a political outcome, but a moral insult. He believed that the will of the people had been disregarded, twisted by private arrangements and backroom negotiations. And once Jackson believed something with his whole being, it was nearly impossible to shake him from it. Upon returning to the Hermitage, he found that he was not alone in his anger. Letters came from all across the nation: farmers, merchants, war veterans, and ordinary citizens who felt that they had been ignored and spoken over by powerful voices they did not recognize and did not trust. The election had awakened something in them, an awareness of the divide between the people and the institutions that governed them. This dissatisfaction needed a figure to rally around, and Jackson became that figure almost without effort. His home soon felt less like a plantation and more like a headquarters. Visitors arrived daily, bringing news, offering support, seeking direction. Jackson listened to them all, attention sharp and unwavering, even as his health faded at times from old wounds that never fully healed. His eyes remained clear, focused on a future he believed the nation deserved. But anger alone could not win the presidency. The path forward required organization, alliances, and strategy, the very elements of politics Jackson had once despised. Here, he found an unexpected advantage. His closest supporters, men like Martin Van Buren, recognized an opportunity to channel the energy of Jackson's following into something newer and more powerful. What emerged was not merely a campaign, it was a political movement. The old structures of American politics began to shift. Newspapers sympathetic to Jackson sprang up in towns and cities, printing editorials that spoke directly to the common man. They described him not as a soldier or a politician, but as the embodiment of the American story. A boy who had known hunger, who had felt the sting of war on his skin, who had lost family, who had risen not because of lineage, but through perseverance. The more they repeated this image, the truer it became in the public mind. Jackson did not need to speak much for his message to travel. His silence often worked in his favor. Supporters spoke on his behalf, repeating stories that cast him as fearless, unwavering, and loyal to those who stood with him. Meanwhile, his opponents struggled to counter this growing force. They accused him of being ill-tempered, uneducated, unfit for office. But these criticisms did not weaken his support. They strengthened it. The people saw them not as warnings, but as proof of the divide between them and the political elite. Rachel watched all of this unfold with quiet concern. She had never wanted public life. The scrutiny pressed on her like a weight she could not shake. Yet, she supported her husband with warmth and devotion. She prayed for peace, for the storm to pass, but she sensed that the tide of events was far beyond the reach of prayer alone. Jackson loved her fiercely, and her suffering pained him far more than any political insult. But the movement continued to grow. Public gatherings began to adopt new rituals. Campaign rallies grew in size. Voters marched in parades, wearing badges and banners that bore Jackson's name. The nation was changing. Politics was no longer confined to drawing rooms and legislative chambers. It had spilled into streets, farms, marketplaces, taverns. For the first time, ordinary men felt not just represented, but necessary. By 1828, the stage was set for a second presidential contest. The political world had polarized into two clear camps. On one side stood John Quincy Adams, now president, seen by many as the guardian of the old order. On the other stood Andrew Jackson, representing a new idea of democracy, one rooted in popular will rather than elite judgment. The campaign that followed was fierce. Words became weapons, sharper than swords. Newspapers printed personal accusations, twisting private stories into public condemnations. The most painful attacks targeted Rachel. Though the circumstances of her marriage had long been known, political rivals revived the story with malicious intent. They called her immoral, faithless, unworthy of the title of First Lady. Jackson read these articles with a rising fury. His hands, once steady on the battlefield, trembled as he held the papers. He felt a violence build inside him, the same heat that had carried him through duels and wars. But this battle was different. He could not defend Rachel with pistols or steel. He could only endure. Rachel tried to ignore the attacks, but they wore on her spirit. She felt exposed, displayed before the entire nation. Her heart, already fragile, weakened under the strain. Yet she stood beside her husband, smiling when visitors arrived, comforting him when tensions heightened, trying to be a sunbeam in a room of gathering shadows. As Election Day approached, the voices of the people grew louder. The weary, the overlooked, the determined, they rallied to Jackson's cause with a passion rarely seen before in American politics. They believed he represented them, and in believing, they created a new reality. When the results were announced, there was no doubt. Andrew Jackson had won. The victory was overwhelming. The people had spoken, not through whispers, but through thunder. The old order had cracked. Yet even in triumph, sorrow waited. Rachel's health, already taxed by stress and public scrutiny, began to fail soon after the election. The excitement of victory could not soothe her weakened heart. In the days before Jackson was to leave for Washington to assume his role as president, Rachel passed away. Her death struck Jackson with a grief deeper than any wound he had endured. The triumph of the election turned hollow. He believed that the cruelty of his opponents had hastened her death. And from that pain, something within him hardened. He would take office, but he would not forget, nor would he forgive. Chapter 8. President of the People. When Andrew Jackson traveled to Washington in the winter of 1829 to assume the office of president, he did so not in triumph, but in mourning. Rachel's passing had carved a hollow place inside him that no applause, no cheering crowds, no victory procession could fill. The journey to the Capitol was somber. Those who rode with him noticed how he often turned away to stare into the distance, his expression distant and unreadable. His heart, so newly wounded, had not yet begun to heal. Yet the nation waited for him, and the nation was restless. Washington itself had changed since his last visit. The city still carried the elegance of neoclassical government buildings and wide, muddy streets, but the atmosphere was different. People from across the country, farmers, mechanics, merchants, veterans, had traveled long distances simply to witness his inauguration. They filled boarding houses, taverns, and the open fields surrounding the Capitol. For many, this was the first time they had taken part in anything connected to the workings of their government. The sense of anticipation was overwhelming. They believed Jackson was their president, the first to rise from among ordinary citizens rather than from the polished world of privilege. On March 4, 1829, Jackson stepped forward to take his oath of office. The sky above was a hard, cold blue, the air brisk. His voice, though gravel-edged from years of speaking outdoors and through illness, carried firmly across the crowd. He spoke not of technical policy or philosophical theory, but of responsibility. Responsibility to protect the Union, to safeguard the rights of the common man, and to ensure the government served not the few but the many. And the crowd answered him not with polite applause but with a roar. After the ceremony, a celebration was planned at the White House. What followed entered American history as something between legend and warning. Ordinary citizens surged toward the residence, thousands pressing through the doors and into rooms that had once been reserved for officials and diplomats. They wanted to see the home of their president. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted, in their own way, to be part of the moment. Soon the celebration turned chaotic. Glasses broke, furniture toppled, pastries were crushed underfoot, and officials panicked as the crowd swelled beyond what anyone had prepared for. Jackson himself had to be escorted away for his own safety. Punch bowls were moved outdoors to draw people out of the house. What began as a symbol of democracy ended as a symbol of something more complicated, a new, raw force entering American politics. The message was unmistakable. Power had shifted. Jackson, however, was not overwhelmed by this display. He saw in it proof that the office of the presidency belonged to the people. To him, the nation had too long been steered by those who believed themselves born to control it. Now, the doors had been thrown open, quite literally, and the shape of democracy would change because of it. Once settled in office, Jackson began to govern with the same clarity and firmness that had guided him in war. The government, in his view, was riddled with entrenched interests, men who had occupied positions for decades simply because of their connections rather than their abilities. Jackson believed these positions should be available to anyone loyal to the principles of the Republic. Thus began what critics would later call the spoils system. He replaced many government officials with his own supporters. To Jackson, this was fairness, a government that reflected the voice of the people who had chosen it. To his opponents, it was recklessness, even corruption. The debate would shape American politics for generations to come. But Jackson's presidency was not defined by patronage alone. The issues he faced were deep and nation-defining. Foremost among them was the question of federal authority versus states' rights. The problem was not new, but Jackson's approach would be unique. He believed fiercely in the Union, not as a casual arrangement, but as a permanent and binding nation. His experiences in war had shown him the cost of division. Meanwhile, the Bank of the United States, an institution created to stabilize the nation's finances, stood at the center of growing tension. Jackson distrusted it. To him, the bank represented the elite, the well-connected, and the wealthy influencing the workings of government for their own benefit. He saw it as a threat to democracy itself. The conflict that would later unfold would become one of the defining battles of his presidency. But not all of his decisions came from battles of ideology. Some came from the simple, personal values he held closely. Jackson believed deeply in loyalty to friends, to country, and to memory. The loss of Rachel had hardened him further against those he considered enemies. Some said he forgave slowly. Others said he did not forgive at all. Through all of this, the nation continued to change. The mood that had lifted him into office had not faded. Ordinary citizens participated in public life with new energy. Newspapers aligned themselves with parties. Crowds gathered to hear speeches. The people's voice grew louder, more forceful, more central. Yet there was another side to Jackson's presidency, one far darker, one that shaped the lives of thousands and would leave deep scars across the continent. As the nation expanded westward, tensions grew between settlers and Native American tribes who had lived on those lands for generations. Jackson believed that the survival of the United States required control of these territories. Many Americans agreed, especially those eager for farmland and opportunity. The solution Jackson envisioned would come to be known by history as the Indian Removal Act. But that chapter, full of sorrow, displacement, and profound consequence, belonged still ahead in his story. Its shadow was beginning to gather, but it had not yet fallen. For now, Jackson stood at the height of his power, the champion of a new kind of democracy, the voice of the common citizen, the symbol of a nation that believed it had finally found a leader who understood it. But greatness in history is never simple. It is often a tangle of conviction and contradiction, of courage and damage, of triumph and tragedy. And Andrew Jackson, like the nation he led, was all of these things at once. Chapter 9: The Trials of Leadership. The longer Andrew Jackson remained in office, the clearer it became that his presidency would not be remembered for calm or quiet administration. His leadership was storm-worn, shaped by conviction and sharpened by conflict. To Jackson, compromise was a word spoken by men who feared to stand for something. and America, during his tenure, would be asked to decide exactly what it stood for. The first great test of Jackson's presidency came not from a foreign adversary, but from within the Union itself. The state of South Carolina, bristling under federal tariffs that it believed unfairly favored Northern industry, declared that it had the right to nullify federal law within its own borders. The idea was not new. The tension between states' rights and federal power had existed since the founding of the nation. But never before had a state spoken so boldly or with such open challenge. For Jackson, whose devotion to the Union was nearly sacred, the nullification crisis was more than political disagreement. It was rebellion. The same man who had fought and bled to defend his country in battle now felt the country threatened once more, not by British soldiers or frontier enemies, but by division inside the very government he led. He reacted swiftly and with unmistakable firmness. If one state can annul the laws of the Union is a rope of sand, he declared. He took steps to strengthen federal enforcement, preparing to send troops if necessary. His political enemies expected hesitation. They expected him to negotiate carefully. Instead, they found a president ready to defend the Union with the same ferocity he once showed on the battlefield. This shocked his opponents, for Jackson was often seen as a champion of the common man and the rights of the states. But to Jackson, loyalty to the Union stood above all regional interests. He believed that if the United States fragmented, its promise, its very soul, would collapse. Eventually, compromise did come, guided by congressional leaders who feared civil conflict. Tariffs were adjusted, tempers cooled, and troops never marched. But the message Jackson sent lingered across the nation. The United States would remain united, and no state would break that bond without consequence. While the nullification crisis was looming, another struggle, one more personal, more bitter, and more public, was unfolding: the bank war. The Bank of the United States, powerful and deeply rooted, stood as a symbol of national financial stability to some, and of elite control to others. Its president, Nicholas Biddle, was an intelligent, poised man, everything Jackson was not, at least in the eyes of Washington's aristocracy. Biddle believed in order through financial structure. Jackson believed in liberty through opportunity. And to Jackson, the bank represented a concentration of power far too dangerous to be allowed. He made no secret of his distrust. He saw the bank as a fortress for wealthy interests, a tool that could be used to influence elections, manipulate credit, and shape the economy to benefit the elite. To him, it was the antithesis of democracy. When Congress passed a bill to re-charter the bank, Jackson did not hesitate. His veto message was a declaration not just of policy, but of philosophy. He wrote that the government should not make the rich richer and the powerful more powerful, but must lift the humble and the oppressed. His words rippled across the country. Supporters saw him as a protector of freedom, someone willing to strike down powerful institutions to defend the public. Opponents saw him as a demagogue, dangerous, emotional, unpredictable. The veto intensified the division in American political life, but Jackson was unmoved. He believed he was acting not for himself, but for the people who had placed him in office. Yet even as he squared off with states and financiers, the most painful legacy of his presidency unfolded: the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral homelands. To many Americans of the era, westward expansion symbolized opportunity, progress, and the promise of land and prosperity. But the lands they sought were home to Native American nations with deep-rooted traditions, families, and histories. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave the government the authority to exchange tribal lands in the east for new lands west of the Mississippi River. Jackson believed he was preventing conflict, that relocating tribes would protect them from encroaching settlers. He spoke of the policy as if it were a practical necessity, even an act of rough paternal care, but the reality was far harsher. For the tribes forced to move, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others, the removals resulted in death, displacement, and heartbreak. Homes lost, lives uprooted, memories severed from the land that had shaped them. The most tragic of these removals, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, would occur shortly after Jackson left office, but it was born from policies he championed. Jackson rarely doubted himself. He believed his decisions, however painful, were made for the good of the nation. But history would remember this chapter with sorrow. The cost was undeniable, the pain enduring. Meanwhile, the country's political identity continued to shift. Jackson's presidency marked the rise of a new political party, the Democrats, built around his vision of popular power and suspicion of entrenched privilege. In opposition, a coalition of critics, disillusioned statesmen, bankers, and intellectuals formed the Whig Party. The political landscape had reorganized itself in response to Jackson, a testament to the scale of his influence. Some praised him as the first truly democratic president, the man who gave voice to the majority. Others condemned him as a tyrant, an executive who wielded power with too heavy a hand. Both views contained truth, for Jackson was a man of profound contradictions. He was a defender of the Union, who feared only its collapse. He was a champion of common citizens, who dismissed the rights of native peoples. He fought privilege, yet held immense personal authority. He was compassionate in loyalty, ruthless in opposition. As his second term drew towards its end, Jackson's health began to fail. The wounds and illnesses he had carried since youth flared painfully. He had given all his strength to the office, and the toll was visible. But he remained unbowed. He had shaped the nation according to his vision, and he believed he had done his duty. When he announced that he would not seek a third term, the nation was divided, but no one was indifferent. Jackson had changed America. The country that would follow was different than the one he had inherited. Andrew Jackson prepared to leave public life, but his story was not yet finished.
Chapter 10: The Last Years and an Unfinished Legacy. By the time Andrew Jackson left the White House in 1837, his once rugged frame had grown frail. The years of battles, on fields, in courtrooms, and in the halls of government had pressed heavily upon him. His health was long compromised. Bullets from duels remained lodged in his body. Chronic infections tormented him, and the weight of political wars never truly lifted. Yet, even as age and illness crept upon him, Jackson remained a restless spirit, unyielding, watchful, and deeply invested in the future of the nation he had helped shape. He returned to his beloved plantation, the Hermitage, near Nashville, Tennessee. The mansion stood as a testament to the wealth he had gathered across his lifetime. Cotton fields cultivated by enslaved laborers, gardens stretching out beneath a wide southern sky, and rooms furnished with elegant decor brought from his years in Washington. But the Hermitage was not merely a place of rest. It remained a command center, a place where Jackson continued to advise political allies and influence the direction of the Democratic Party. Jackson's correspondence became relentless. He wrote letters daily, sometimes dozens in a week, discussing national issues with fervor. Even outside public office, he shaped presidential elections and political debates. His successor and closest ally, Martin Van Buren, inherited a country sliding into economic panic, and Jackson offered unwavering strategic counsel. Political opponents feared that though Jackson was gone from Washington, his shadow still towered over the Capitol like a monument carved in stone. Yet beneath this political fire remained unresolved contradictions. Jackson believed himself a champion of the common man, yet his wealth was built on slavery, and he owned over 100 enslaved people at the height of his power. He viewed himself as a patriarch, someone who saw slavery as both natural and necessary to the Southern economy. The enslaved men, women, and children who worked at the Hermitage lived lives of forced labor and control, and their presence was a quiet, permanent reminder of the moral complexities that shaped his legacy. Jackson also lived to see the long-term consequences of his Indian Removal Act. The policy he defended as a measure of national security and progress had unleashed immense suffering. The Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee and members of other tribes died while being forced to relocate westward, occurred shortly after he left office. Reports of starvation, disease, and freezing conditions accompanied the news. Some Cherokees who knew Jackson personally wrote to him for mercy. Others remembered him as a figure of betrayal. Jackson never recanted his stance. To his dying days, he believed relocation was the only way to avoid conflict and preserve civilization, though history would carve a far harsher judgment. Meanwhile, the nation changed quickly around him. Railroads cut through valleys, cities expanded, the telegraph whispered news at unprecedented speeds. The country Jackson once imagined as a collective of agrarian states was now leaning into industry, invention, and ambition. But at the Hermitage, time moved with a different rhythm. Slow, humid summer days, autumn leaves rustling like long-remembered songs, and candlelight flickering through large windowed rooms. His closest companions in those final years included his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., and a small circle of loyal friends and relatives. Jackson enjoyed telling war stories, recalling battles with lively detail, though occasionally a tremor of sorrow passed through him when speaking of his late wife Rachel, whose death he always blamed on the stresses of political slander. He kept her memory close. Every portrait was polished, every story told with reverence, every flower planted near her grave chosen with care. As illness deepened, Jackson experienced spells of fever, coughing fits, and pain that bent his posture, but never his voice. He continued offering political advice even when bedridden, his mind sharp as ever. Visitors often remarked that the old general could still command a room with a whisper. In 1844, a new presidential race stirred the nation, and Jackson once again dove into the fray. He threw his support behind James K. Polk, a fellow Tennessean who had once been a protege. Against all expectations, Polk won, largely credited to Jackson's endorsement. The victory reaffirmed Jackson's influence. Even from a rocking chair, he could still shape the country. But life is finite, even for legends. On June 8, 1845, surrounded by family and close friends in his bedroom at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson took his final breaths. A soft breeze from the open window stirred the curtains, and voices murmured prayers. He whispered his last words, reported to be expressions of faith and of longing to reunite with Rachel. And then the man who had dueled, commanded, governed, and reshaped a nation was gone. The nation mourned, though not unanimously. His supporters honored him as a self-made hero, a defender of democracy, and the man who had placed the presidency within reach of ordinary citizens. His critics, especially those who suffered under his policies, remembered him with bitterness as a symbol of oppression and a force of uncompromising nationalism. History would continue to debate him long after his death. Some see him as the embodiment of American populism,
a fighter who believed the government should serve the people, not wealthy elites or entrenched institutions. Others see a legacy stained by violence, racial injustice, and authoritarian impulses. Both perspectives are true, and neither cancels the other. What remains undeniable is this: Andrew Jackson shaped the United States in ways few individuals ever have. His life was a storm, brutal, courageous, contradictory, and unforgettable. He left behind a country forever changed, a legacy both celebrated and mourned, and a story that continues to echo whenever the nation questions who it is and who it wishes to become. His statue stands in public squares, his portrait once adorned currency, and his name remains etched in textbooks and public debates. But perhaps his truest monument is the unresolved tension within the American identity itself, the struggle between democracy and power, equality and authority, idealism and ambition. Andrew Jackson lived at the heart of that struggle, and in many ways, the nation still does too.
If you liked this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more great stories.